Throughout our planet's long history, millions of animal species have enjoyed a long tenure of roaming the Earth, only to be unceremoniously wiped out by the unforgiving forces of nature, or in the case of more current extinctions, by humans. It's easy to think of extinctions as things that happened centuries and centuries in the past, and usually by more or less natural means. But the truth is that the pace of extinction has increased dramatically in recent decades. According to one study, this rate could be up to 1,000 times the usual rate of extinction, and humans are the reason for the increase. Within the last century, and even within the last decade, we've lost entire species whose time on Earth may not have had to come to a premature end if not for our activities. And today we'll be looking at the tip of the iceberg, the top 10 animals which have recently gone extinct. At the beginning of the 20th century, the black rhinoceros was a ubiquitous presence on the African plains. It's estimated that at this time there were over 1 million of them, composed of 4 different subspecies. But unfortunately, in the early decades of the 1900s, hunting these animals for sport became a common pastime among the rich, with little thought given to the effect that widespread hunting could have on the animal's population. The rhinos' numbers were decimated, and by the time environmental groups began to take notice later in the century, it was far too late. Despite efforts to protect the rhinos, poachers who were mainly after their horns for use in traditional Chinese medicine had diminished their numbers even further. By 2001, one entire subspecies was gone, and the rhinos' numbers had dropped to only about 2,300. In particular danger, the West African black rhino, a subspecies which optimistic estimates guessed might number in the dozens. Conservationists spotted the last living member of this species early in the 21st century, and in 2011, the International Union for Conservation of Nature formally declared that the western black rhino had gone extinct. Unfortunately, it is highly unlikely that this will be the last rhino species to suffer this fate. The JAVAN rhino is down to fewer than 50 specimens, while the northern white rhino is in serious trouble, with only 7 adults known to currently exist. The PYRENEAN IBEX was one of 4 subspecies of wild goat that used to populate the Iberian Peninsula, which is mostly divided between Portugal and Spain. Although the last living specimen died in 2000, the PYRENEAN IBEX is one of only a few animals that have been targeted by genetic scientists for a possible return from extinction by way of cloning, so far unsuccessfully. Like many species that have died out naturally, it is theorized that the ibex suffered from competition for resources in its natural habitat, which it shared with many other foraging species including sheep, horses, and cattle. But conservationists have been keeping an eye on their dwindling numbers for some time. And before the death of the last specimen, a female named Celia, tissue was harvested from the animal with the aim to reproduce the species through recently advanced cloning technology. However, there was a problem. Only female clones could be reproduced from the genetic material, meaning that no males would be available for breeding. Nevertheless, the endeavor moved forward in 2003, with one clone having been produced from tissue taken from Celia's inner ear. But the clone died just moments after birth due to lung defects, and thus far the experiment has not been repeated. The Caribbean monk seal was placed on the endangered species list in March 1967, 15 years after the last confirmed sighting of a living specimen. While they were once plentiful in number, their tendency to remain sedentary while resting or nursing pups made them easy prey for hunters, which led directly to a rapid decrease in their population. After decades with no confirmed sightings, the Fisheries Service of the NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, conducted a 5-year review to determine if indeed there were any live specimens left. The review concluded that overhunting had rendered the Caribbean monk seal's numbers untenable, and in 2008 it was announced officially that the species had gone extinct, the first and so far the only seal population to die out as a direct result of human activity. The NOAA also expressed concern over the last 2 surviving monk seal populations on Earth, which inhabit waters near Hawaii and the Mediterranean, as their numbers have also been steadily declining, but expressed hope that enough can be learned from our failure to protect their Caribbean relatives to enact stronger protection for these gentle creatures. In the mid-1800s, the passenger pigeon was easily the most abundant bird in all of North America, and possibly the entire world. The arrival of a flock was described by one conservationist as a feathered tempest, as the birds traveled in huge numbers capable of blotting out the sun, part of their evolutionary strategy. Their sheer numbers made them able to ward off predators and successfully compete for resources with other species. In 1871, naturalist A.W. Shorger estimated their breeding population at a staggering 136 million adults, but by 1914, the very last last living specimen died at the Cincinnati Zoo, and the passenger pigeon was no more. Its extinction was perhaps the first great cautionary tale about the dangers of overhunting. Simply put, it was considered absurd that any amount of hunting could endanger a population so enormous, a notion which only took 4 short decades to prove its falsehood. The pigeon's strategy of flocking together in enormous numbers proved to be the species' ultimate downfall, as hunters invented newer and even more efficient ways of tracking and killing off entire flocks. Today's scientists at the Passenger Pigeon Project are also exploring ways to use genetic science to bring the passenger pigeon back from extinction. But they also seek to educate the public about the once proud species whose extinction became the impetus for the birth of the modern conservation movement, which took shape in the mid-20th century. The thylacine, commonly known as the Tasmanian tiger, was another species which the conservation movement arrived too late to save. The last known living specimen was captured in the 1930s, and today the Tasmanian tiger can only be viewed in one place, at the National Museum of Australia, where the preserved carcasses of several specimens are on display. The Tasmanian tiger suffered from its reputation as a nuisance species, one which made a habit of killing livestock, making them an easy scapegoat for the poor financial returns of rural farms during a period of depression in Tasmania. They were trapped and shot with impunity, and even when they were declared a protected species in 1936, worried farmers still had no qualms about shooting them on sight. Some say that holdover packs of Tasmanian tigers can still be sighted deep in the mysterious Australian outback, but this is more of a legend than anything else, as the species was officially declared extinct the same year that their protected status was enacted. The TECOPA pupfish was a fascinating, heat-resistant species of fish native to a pair of hot springs in California's Mojave Desert. First identified in 1948, the species had the remarkable ability to survive and even thrive in the waters of the hot springs, which could reach temperatures in excess of 110 degrees Fahrenheit. They had probably existed for thousands or perhaps millions of years, but it only took a few decades after their identification for the species to disappear from the Earth altogether. This is due almost exclusively to the emergence of hot springs as tourist resorts in the 1950s and 60s, which led to the extensive modification of the pupfish's natural habitat. During the construction of bathhouses and other attendant structures, the hot springs pools were enlarged, and their outflows to the nearby Amargosa River diverted, which led to 2 unforeseen consequences: the elevation of downstream water temperatures and the introduction of invasive species, including a different pupfish species native to the Amargosa. By 1965, the TECOPA pupfish were found to be nearly extinct, and by the early 1970s they were gone. In 1978, Assistant Secretary of the Interior Robert Herbst decried the loss, calling it totally avoidable, and noting that the same projects which disrupted the pupfish's habitat could have, had they been planned more carefully, ensured its survival. The JAVAN tiger was smaller than a lot of other tiger species, with an average body length of only about 8 feet for the largest males, but what they lacked in size they made up for in ferocity. British scientist Charles Partington stated that an adult male was capable of breaking the legs of much larger animals, such as horses and buffaloes, using only its paws, and the deer and wild boar which roamed the Indonesian island of Java lived in fear of this cunning predator. But during the 20th century, Java's human population exploded, and with this increase came the necessity of clearing vast portions of the tiger's habitat to make way for farming, construction, and other human activities. As early as the 1940s, Javan tigers had mostly retreated from the human expansion, making their new habitats in the remote forests and mountains of the island. By the 1970s, only one known population remained on Mount Batten, one of Java's highest peaks, which is where the last known living specimen was sighted in 1976. As with the Tasmanian tiger, alleged sightings of these beasts in remote areas of the island continue to this day. But several expeditions into the wild to confirm these sightings have proven unfruitful, and the Javan tiger remains officially extinct. The BUBAL hartebeest, a type of antelope, once roamed around the entire continent of Africa in enormous numbers, but those numbers were substantially and brutally thinned during the 1800s, particularly during the French conquest of Algeria, when vast herds were slaughtered by the invading colonial army. In 1917, one of the last known remaining herds, numbering only 15, was discovered in Morocco, and all but 3 of them were killed by a lone hunter. The BUBAL hartebeest was chosen to be protected under the 1933 London Convention, but of course this was much too little too late. While it was speculated that unknown herds could exist in remote regions of Africa as late as the 1940s, the last captive female died in 1923, and subsequent expeditions attempting to locate additional herds have always come up empty. The golden toad once inhabited a Costa Rican preserve north of the city of Monteverde, occupying an area no larger than 4 square miles. They weren't discovered and identified until 1964, and at that time the extremely localized population was estimated to be no more than about 1,500 toads. Since that time, records have been meticulously kept, chronicling the species' dwindling numbers but failing to pinpoint the cause, until well after the last known sighting in 1989, when it was hypothesized that El Niño weather patterns caused by global climate change had been a contributing factor. The International Union for the Conservation of Nature declared the species officially extinct in 2004, and in exploring possible causes asserted that global warming and airborne pollution had led to conditions which brought about high mortality rates in males of the species, which had already been outnumbered by females 10 to 1. Although this has been debated and alternative causes explored, such as an unexplained fungal infection, the IUCN found that all available data supported the El Niño hypothesis, leading the golden toad to receive a dubious honor, the first known animal species to go extinct due to human-induced climate change. For 20 million years, the BAIJI dolphin, also known as the Chinese river dolphin, made its home in China's Yangtze River, an ancient cradle of civilization. As recently as a few decades ago, a strong and thriving population of 6,000 made their annual migration journey down the historic river. But China's move toward industrialization in the 1950s proved to be too deadly a foe for even this hardy population to survive. Human development along the Yangtze in the later half of the 20th century was extraordinarily rapid, and in addition to being hunted for their meat and leather, the BAIJI's habitat was quickly degraded to an unsustainable degree. Overfishing also decimated the population of the BAIJI dolphin's prey, and environmental protections enacted by the Chinese government in the 1970s arrived too late to have any meaningful effect on the species' decline. By 1990, the BAIJI dolphin was critically endangered, with only about 100 specimens remaining, and by 1997 that number was down to 13. By dawn of the new millennium, they were gone forever. The first extinction of a large mammal species in over 50 years, and one that, given the BAIJI dolphin's long history, occurred in the relative blink of an eye.